Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about unrest and change in the 1950s, looking at some of the problems and social tensions that existed during this time period that is usually remembered as a very good time in American history. Here are your video goals. All right, so in the 1950s, there were a lot of social groups who were left out of the general prosperity and who were finding the situation in America more and more unacceptable. As the children of the baby boom got older and grew into teenagers, they began to find their life in the 1950s boring and oppressive and started to seek new ways of expressing themselves. Women who were forced into the roles of housewives and moms were starting to realize that these roles were not leading to the sort of happiness that was promised by society and advertisements and stuff like that. And African Americans were continuing to be oppressed by racial and economic inequality that was rampant in the 1950s. And so all of these tensions start to come to the surface over the course of the 1950s. And we're going to look at each of these in greater detail. We'll start first with youth culture. So middle class youth, born in the suburbs, raised in the suburbs, as they became older, they began to find the sort of norms and expectations of suburban life to be incredibly boring. And so they sought out sort of new ways of living, different from the norms of their parents, new modes of self-expression. And what you see is the rise of a new culture that is oriented towards and motivated by young people's demand for something new and interesting. And the main way that the young middle class exerts an influence upon culture is by spending money. They are willing to spend money in order to get these new sort of rebellious images and feelings that they want. So basically they go out and buy products that promise liberation. We see this in rock and roll, which becomes one of the most popular musical genres in the 1950s and remains very popular in American culture from then on. And this is embodied most fully in sort of one of the first major platinum rock stars, and that is Elvis Presley, who combined traditional country music with traditional black musical traditions of blues and wrapped it all up with a sort of rebellious bad boy image. And this type of music, along with this image, was incredibly popular among young Americans, and Elvis sold millions and millions of records. In a similar genre, or a similar manner, movies became more and more a way for the youth to seek out sort of some kind of avenue for rebellion. And all sorts of movies came out with young people like defying their elders and seeking out a new way of life for themselves. And one of the most famous people who did this was James Dean in a movie, Rebel Without a Cause. You don't need to remember that, really. We'll probably bring it up again in class or maybe look at it a little bit. But basically, both in rock and roll and in movies, young people basically get to live vicariously through these rebellious movie stars and rock stars rather than actually becoming rebellious themselves. Now, there was a group that really did rebel in a very serious way from normal social and cultural ways of life in the 1950s, and this group was called the Beats. And the Beats were a group of writers and poets who rejected all the social norms of 1950s culture. They hated suburbia, they rejected traditional consumerism, they thought getting a job with a big corporation was a waste of time. And they also questioned a lot of the pillars of 1950s society. They questioned consumerism, they rejected sexual norms and the sort of nuclear family, And they also experimented with drugs and wrote about all of these things. And this becomes a powerful cultural force, but it's kind of limited only to big cities. It doesn't become a major mass movement in the 1950s. But all of these things lay the groundwork for the youth rebellion of the 1960s that we'll talk about in a later video. Also in the 1950s, we see the beginning of a very organized sort of second wave of feminism. So we already saw some feminist activists earlier in the course when we looked at people fighting for women's suffrage. And now we're going to see another wave of feminism that's fighting more for social equality and cultural equality of women. And so if you went back and looked at 1950s magazines, you would see an image of what the perfect mom was supposed to be like, the perfect woman. And she was obedient to her husband and to her father. She worked hard to keep her family happy. She always looked really pretty, kept the house very nice. And she basically kind of seems like a housekeeping robot. And this was the norm that women were expected to live up to. And some women during the 1950s begin to push back against this. One, who we have already heard about, is Margaret Sanger, who worked along with scientists to develop a birth control pill. And this is a pill that women can take, and it will prevent them from getting pregnant. And what this means is that for the first time, it's totally up to a woman whether or not she's going to have kids. All you have to do is take this pill and you'll never have kids. Or not never, but it's very effective. And it's a really good way for women who don't want to become moms to not become a mom. And it makes pregnancy a choice. Also, a very important figure in this second wave of feminism is a woman named Betty Friedan, who writes a very influential book called The Feminine Mystique. And she talks about all sorts of stuff, but some of the main points in this book are that she argues that the social norms of the 1950s are leading to widespread unhappiness among American women, and that women are prevented from achieving their full potential as individuals. Basically, she argues that women are sort of being sacrificed to their families, giving up their individuality, giving up their own needs and desires in order to take care of their husbands and kids. And Betty Friedan argues against this for a new sort of social norm where women are given the same opportunities to develop themselves as men are. And finally, we have the civil rights movement, which begins as a major mass movement in the 1950s and ultimately leads to huge changes in the American social fabric. So we're going to look first at what happened in the 1950s to start this massive movement. So first of all, segregation and systematized violence against Black people in America was rampant in the 1950s. Basically, ever since the end of the Civil War, systems of segregation and systematized violence had been used to keep Black people in a subordinate role in the U.S. In U.S. society. In the South, this oppression was open and legal. There were laws separating Black people and white people, and there were organized violent groups who could potentially be labeled as terrorists, most notably the KKK, who used violence to intimidate any Black people who tried to speak out against this oppression. Now, in the North, things were not that different. Most Black people lived in segregated areas, and people who spoke out for change were also likely to be attacked. Now, one of the first major changes that sparks this movement is a Supreme Court decision called Brown versus Board of Education. And in the early 50s, a group of Black students, with help from the NAACP, were able to successfully challenge the laws that made segregation of public schools legal in the South. And the Supreme Court, after hearing this case, ruled that segregation was unconstitutional and that the schools had to integrate. That is, that black kids and white kids would go to school together. And in the South, white leaders almost unanimously promised massive resistance. Basically, that they would do everything in their power to stop integration from happening and keep black people and white people separate. And what this meant is that any African American who tried to integrate and tried to follow the laws that said that they could go to a white public school, or a public school that was now for everybody, they would risk being attacked. So it was really quite dangerous. And for several years, no integration happened. In fact, it wasn't until, in some cases, that the president sent in the army that schools integrated. A year later, in 1955, a teenager, a 14-year-old named Emmett Till, was brutally murdered, that is, lynched, in a small town in Mississippi for allegedly flirting with a white woman who was married to a shopkeeper, a white shopkeeper in that town. A few days later, that white shopkeeper and a couple people showed up at Emmett Till's house and took him and killed him and threw him in a river. These two men were put on trial, and they were acquitted by an all-white jury. So these men killed a black child and got away with it. However, this was a major turning point because now, in the 1950s, with television, newspaper reporters were able to show the entire nation the extent to which violence and brutality was being used in the South to maintain a system of racial oppression. And this, along with Brown versus Board of Education and a lot of other stuff, helps to spark a massive movement to change the racial order in America. And we get the beginning of the civil rights movement. And we'll revisit this again when we talk about the 1960s, when a lot of the civil rights movement's major achievements occur. But the 1950s is really the beginning of organized, effective mass mobilization in order to change the racial system in America. And basically, what's interesting is you see two different strategies emerge. There are different groups who argue for different strategies for getting civil rights for black people. And the two different strategies are called integrationist and separatist. And we'll look at the integrationist strategy first, which was the one that was most widely supported by black leaders and also by white leaders. And the integrationist strategy, what you wanted to do is you wanted to create laws that would allow black people and white people to live together equally within American society. And one of the major groups leading the integrationist movement was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And basically their strategy here, and it was a very effective strategy, was to use black churches as the major organizational backbone of a new social movement. The leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, was Martin Luther King, who we've already learned a lot about, who advocated for a strategy of civil disobedience. And basically what this meant is you were going to use nonviolent displays of resistance in order to raise national awareness about racial oppression in the South. And basically King's strategy here was to show the rest of the nation how messed up stuff was, and that by stirring up public sympathy for black people in the South, that this would put pressure on the U.S. government in order to act to change the system. And one of his first major successes was the Montgomery bus boycott, where after a respectable older lady named Rosa Parks was asked basically to move out of her seat so that a white person could sit, and she was arrested for not complying. The entire black population of Montgomery rejected the city's bus system for more than a year, and gained massive media recognition for their organized and peaceful efforts to change an unjust system. And we're going to definitely talk more about King in later videos. But also, we need to acknowledge that there was another strategy that groups called for, and this was called the separatist strategy. And the major group in the United States that called for separatism was called the Nation of Islam, led by a man named Elijah Muhammad, who believed that he had sort of received a call from God in order to lead American black people to a sort of new society, a better society, founded on the principles of the religion of Islam. And one of the main ideas expressed by Elijah Muhammad and his followers was that African Americans should not try to integrate with white society, but rather build up an independent and powerful black community. Basically, Elijah Muhammad taught that white people had always exploited black people and always would. So any attempts to get along with white people would just lead to further exploitation and oppression, and that rather black people should learn to become self-sufficient and take care of themselves. One of the major aspects of Elijah Muhammad's views was also that black people should reject white culture, and especially Christianity. That Christianity was sort of a white person's religion, and that Islam was an African religion. Now it gets a little blurry because of course both Christianity and Islam started in the Middle East, but it is true that much of Africa had converted to Islam hundreds, if not almost 1,000 years ago. Anyway, one of the major figures in the Nation of Islam was a man named Malcolm X, and he was a very powerful speaker, a very charismatic person, and he was able to gain national recognition for the Nation of Islam because of his outspoken criticism of white America, and he by the early 1960s would go on to be one of the most prominent civil rights leaders and speakers throughout in the United States and also throughout the world, gaining international recognition. And we'll definitely talk more about him in the future as well. What I want you to think about now, though, is what do you think were the costs and benefits of each strategy? I don't want to go into that here, but I want you to think about it and think about what does each strategy stand to gain in terms of civil rights for black people, and what does each strategy risk? If you were to pursue an integrationist or a separatist strategy, what do you think could go wrong there? So anyway, that's something we'll explore in class. And all right, that is our video for today. Here are your terms. You will have a quiz, so please make sure you learn all this stuff.